My name is Brendan Teeling. I'm the founder and director of the festival, and I'm delighted to be welcoming this evening Andrew Roberts and Lisa Marie Griffiths. Andrew is a great friend of the festival. He was with us before in fantastic talk about Napoleon. Delighted to welcome him back. He's a biographer and historian of international renown and currently visiting professor at the Department of War Studies at King's College London and the Roger and Martha Metz visiting research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Lisa Marie Griffith is the author of Dublin Then and Now and Stones of Dublin, A History of Dublin and 10 Buildings, and has published a number of essays on Dublin history. She's the co-editor of two edited collections of essays, Leaders of the City, Dublin's First Citizens, and Death and Dying in Dublin, 1500 to the Present. So without further ado, let me hand you over to our speakers, and I hope you enjoy our session this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brendan. Andrew, on behalf of the Dublin History Festival, I'm delighted to welcome you back to Dublin, unfortunately virtually this year, but to what would have been at the beginning of the reign of George III, the second city in the empire. Your biography is really wonderful, and I'm looking forward to digging into the very long reign of George III.
Thank you very much indeed, Lisa Marie. It's a delight to be back.
I might start off, if you don't mind, digging into some of the kind of personal relationships of the Hanoverians, because I think anytime you kind of get into a biography of famous people, and in particular royalty, the family relations really becomes fascinating. And the Hanoverians have been described as one of the most dysfunctional families to ever sit on the throne of Great Britain. And really that kind of jumps out at the beginning of the book. And one of the things that I was amazed by is in particular the relationship between George II and his son Frederick, who was the father of George III. And George II and his wife really have a terrible relationship with Frederick.
Yes, they hated their son. As you said, the Hanoverians have a very strange dysfunctional thing. It's an intergenerational loathing, effectively. George I also hated his son, George II. And unfortunately, George IV would end up hating his father, George III. So the only break in this is between George III and his father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, who died when George III was 12. But the hatred, as you say, I think that the prize goes basically to George II versus Frederick, Prince of Wales, because George II and his wife, Queen Caroline, actually celebrated when their son died, and then left his body to not be buried at Westminster Abbey for 2 weeks. So poor old George III, as the 12-year-old grandson, effectively, was left with the decomposing corpse of his father in the room above until finally they got round to burying him. So yeah, and then after that he had a terrible relationship, understandably, I think, under those circumstances, with George II, who boxed his ears and abused him physically. And this used to happen at Hampton Court, which was the palace that George II lived in. And it so sort of traumatized him that he refused ever to step foot there again. When he was told much later on in his reign that part of it had burnt down, he said how sad he was that the whole thing hadn't burnt down.
Really astonishing. And even just some of the stories in the biography that kind of delve into that relationship, very poignant. It does have to be said, though, that luckily for George III, he has this really wonderful relationship with his father before he dies, and then later on with his mother, who takes great care of him. And both of them are very invested, in particular, in his education, and give him this really wonderful education. One of the things that really struck me is that they set out from the beginning to raise George and educate him to be an Enlightenment king, with all that kind of meant. And I was struck as well that he was the first monarch to learn science, for instance. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about his education.
Yes, that's right. I mean, it had its own problems, of course, having a mother who was widowed for so long, and because not least the rumor went round that she was sleeping with George III's tutor, the Earl of Bute, who George III later made as one of his prime ministers early on in his reign. And so people thought that it was what they called petticoat government, that she had should sort of inveigled the Earl of Bute into the premiership and so on. But George III himself, who knew perfectly well this was not true, was traumatized by this as well. And when his mother, his beloved mother, who actually was a blameless woman and a philanthropic woman and not at all the sort of political figure that she's been made out to be, when she was buried at Westminster Abbey, the crowd booed her coffin and jeered as it was taken through the streets to be buried. So that even in that sense, the family managed to sort of be a source of pain to him. The answer is, of course, that Bute, in fact, was a hugely enlightened figure. He was interested in botany, science, as you mentioned. He was a linguist. He was a highly impressive figure. Not a great politician, as it turned out, when he became prime minister. But as far as a tutor was concerned, he was as good as it got. And he also introduced George to architecture. And of course, the glories of Georgian architecture, I hardly need to mention that to somebody who lives in Dublin, is one of the glories of the age. And this was largely down to William Chambers and Adam and Wyatt and Soane and all of these extraordinary fine architects that were promoted by George III, who also, when it came to science, built up the largest collection of scientific instruments in the world at that time. If you ever go to the Science Museum in London, the whole of the second floor pretty much is dedicated to this extraordinary collection of scientific instruments.
That's amazing. I didn't realize about the scientific instruments in that collection. He has been called the most cultured monarch to hold the throne of Great Britain. And you really can see it in the book that comes through, his kind of dedication to learning. And in particular, I really liked how you delved into his creation of his library, and he's such an amazing bibliophile. And I loved when you talked as well about the relationship with Samuel Johnson.
Yes, the library that he built up at Buckingham House, now Buckingham Palace, which he bought for his wife Queen Charlotte in 1761, was it wound up being 80,000 books. And the great thing about it was that he let scholars and learned people into their house to use his library. It wasn't just for him. And one of the people who used it quite a lot was Dr. Johnson, and they met in 1764 in the library and had a long conversation, which Johnson, when Johnson came away, he said that he had been, he's hugely respectful of George's intellect, which is something that has been under attack. The Whig historians for 200 years tried to make George out to be thick, and also Tom Paine, the hugely best-selling American propagandist, at least English-born but American citizen propagandist, was he called him the royal brute. And yet this is the man who set up the Royal Academy, who bought the longest telescope in the world, who had the planet Uranus named after him, and who bought half of the pictures in the Royal Collection, which today is the largest private art collection in the world.
And yet, actually, while you're talking about all of the charities that he supported and all of the learned institutions and the collection of his library, he was actually a very frugal monarch and really watched his money. And I guess in the same way, he had that kind of approach to national debt and the finances of Britain. So it's not like he's spending all around him, and it's reflective of that. He is spending in a very particular way.
And very much not on himself, really. I mean, he wore the same kind of clothes. He dressed like a normal English gentleman at a time when, if you looked over the other side of the channel, you had the Bourbons who were dressing up like peacocks and Christmas trees day in, day out. He was yes, as you say, he was frugal. Unfortunately, of course, this wasn't the case with his son, George IV, who had compulsive buying disorder, and he spent on himself and on his clothes and on his coaches and so on. He was at the most extraordinary degree, to the point that it was almost as much as Britain was spending on the Royal Navy at the time. He really was the Imelda Marcos of the late 18th century. And of course, the king hated that, being frugal himself, as was his wife, Charlotte. He absolutely hated it. And it was one of the reasons for this, one of the many reasons for this intergenerational conflict continuing into the second part of the Hanoverian era.
And father and son in that way and others are really chalk and cheese. For instance, one of the things that really stands out, I guess, having grown up and seeing the bad relationship that his father had with George II, George III, when he becomes monarch, kind of immediately settles down and takes it very serious. You know, he's king now, he needs his wife, and he gets married through an arranged marriage in 1761. He sees his bride, is it the day before or the day of the wedding?
Day of the wedding, literally 6 hours before. He met her for the first time 6 hours before they were married. I know, I mean, to modern ears, it's a completely weird thing for any couple to have to undergo that kind of thing. But what was understood and expected was that the king would marry for this dynastic reason, but would wind up, of course, finding love with some mistress. But what happened with George III was extremely unusual. In fact, he was the only one of the Hanoverian monarchs who never took a mistress, because he fell in love with his wife after he had married her. And she was a very demure, intelligent, hardworking, philanthropic lady, quite unlike the depiction of her in Bridgerton, the TV show. She was a sort of somebody never happier than when reading and listening to music. So actually they gelled together absolutely wonderfully, until we're obviously going to come on to his lunacy, until in one bout of it in 1804, it became completely impossible for her ever to share a bed with him again, and the separation took place.
But even, you mentioned there that they shared a bed. This was very unknown in royal courts as well. And it's a testament really to, I guess, how lucky both of them are that they find each other, and that the marriage works out so well, and that it is such a marriage of love.
Well, it must have been nerve-wracking for her. She's a 17-year-old girl who has never been outside Mecklenburg-Strelitz, which is a small dukedom in Germany, and she then makes a long journey by sea to England, during which everybody in her entourage is seasick except for her, and she spends the time learning "God Save the Queen" God Save the King, I'm sorry, on the harpsichord. So then she marries this person, stays up until 3 o'clock in the morning, and then for the next week goes to balls where she meets people that she's never met before, clearly, and has to learn a new language as well. So all in all, it must have been pretty traumatic, but she got through it extremely well.
It must have been phenomenally intimidating. So it really, yeah, they just seem so lucky when you read about it in the book.
And then they wind up, of course, having 15 children. So there are historians who complain that she was hideously ugly. I don't believe that's true at all. If you look at the paintings and some of the courtiers' remarks, it was a genuine love match. Obviously, there was a physical side to it if there were 15 children, and she proved to be a very good mother. The question later is, of course, whether it's a systemic problem that causes so many of the children to go off the rails.
I was going to mention, actually, so while they marry and then find love, one of the difficulties that George's siblings and their children have is that in the middle of the 18th century and towards the end of the 18th century, this idea of marrying for love becomes more popular. And yet it's not feasible for monarchs or royalty to do that. And yet George ends up in a difficult situation because his brothers begin to have these secret marriages with somebody that they love rather than arranged matches. And that leads to difficulty as well for his children.
Well, it leads to difficulties, and then it also leads to legislation. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which is still in force today, in fact, where princes have to gain the permission of the sovereign before they're allowed to marry. So actually, Prince Harry asked the Queen's permission before he married Meghan Markle, for example. And this was because otherwise they wouldn't be able to declare these marriages where some of them had, one of George III's children had 10 illegitimate children. And it had all sorts of, they had all sorts of political and social ramifications, this kind of behavior. And so the king did try and keep a lid on it with the Royal Marriages Act, which actually did the exact opposite. It made the whole situation worse, in fact, because they went ahead with the marriages, which therefore were illegal, and therefore the children were automatically all illegitimate, and frankly, all hell broke loose.
Yes, and there seems to be quite a list of bigamists, for want of a better word. There's lots of double marriages going on in the book, and those relationships are so interesting. I think one of the other things that I love about political biographies in particular is watching how personal relationships between important political figures have this huge impact on national and international events. And that comes through so often in so many ways in the book. And you mentioned, for instance, Lord Bute, who is his governor, responsible for his education, but who steps in at a time when George III doesn't have a father. George II is being horrendous to him, and he becomes his father figure. And so George puts him in position as prime minister when he takes the throne. And there's so many of those relationships that kind of have a big impact on national and international events. And I was wondering if you could talk about any in particular that you think have a big impact.
Well, you're absolutely right. That one, of course, is the first. And he uses Lord Bute to push through Parliament the approval of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the 7 Years' War, which was quite unpopular with the London populace. They pelted Bute's carriage and booed him in the streets and so on. But he did get this peace treaty through. You then see a bad personal relationship with Lord Grenville, who is the Prime Minister at the time of the passing of the Stamp Act, which causes so much trouble in America. And he, in the end, forces Grenville's resignation, not because of anything to do with the Stamp Act, with which he sees eye to eye with Grenville, but just simply because he finds him a prolix bore and can't bear the sight of him. You get some people like Lord North, who he grew up with, because Lord North's father had been his governor as well at a different period, and who he had known as a childhood friend. There were 6 years in between, but nonetheless, he had never gone to school and only knew the people, the children of the court, and Lord North was one of them. And he stays Prime Minister for 12 years at a completely disastrous time for Britain. It was the worst moment since the loss of the Angevin lands in the 14th century, when Lord North was Prime Minister. And then he has these positive relationships with William Pitt the Elder and William Pitt the Younger, who were really the only two truly brilliant prime ministers of the 14 prime ministers who he appointed.
Phenomenal, 14. So you set out to tackle this idea of George III's reputation. And of course, he has possibly, arguably, the worst reputation in America, because he is the king when America revolts. And the book really investigates how this reputation arose, and you do an awful lot in the book to actually overturn the idea that George III really wasn't the tyrant that they set out to depict him as. And I was wondering, could you talk a little bit about George's kind of opinions of America before, or the 13 colonies before war, and how that changes during the course of war?
Well, they were very positive, in fact. He was interested in America. Many of those books that we were talking about earlier from his library were about America. He had a huge collection, some 40,000 topographical maps that he was interested in, and and a lot of those are of America. He met the Cherokee delegation in 1764, had conversations with every American who came to court. There was no sense that he was an anti-American or despised Americans or anything like that. In the conversations that he had with the royal governors when they came back to England, you know, he portrayed a great interest in American society and economics. So the picture of him as being some kind of sort of distant, sinister figure thousands of miles away who had no interest at all in his colonists is a completely wrong one. He never visited America, of course, and he never visited Ireland either. He was King of Ireland. He never visited Scotland. He never went north of Worcester or west of Plymouth. He never visited. He was Elector of Hanover. He never even visited Hanover. So you have this sense of a man who had enormous, as we mentioned earlier, scientific and agricultural and literary interests, who nonetheless didn't have any actual curiosity about going abroad or to his own dominions in the British Isles. So, you know, it's a very strange thing, really. He had the Industrial Revolution took place from the 1780s onwards, and he never went down a coal mine or to a factory, or I think on one occasion he saw a carpet factory in Axminster, and that was it.
You always get, though, a sense of shyness from that. He's afraid to go out into the world, and he's happy to learn about it from books in a library. And I mean, it is astonishing. It is for somebody who seems so interested in it. But I think what I felt certainly one of the difficulties in his reign is that the press have such a huge freedom during this period. They go completely unchecked. The printing press, there's all these developments in the printing press. Paper is becoming cheaper, printing is cheaper, and so anyone can print anything that they like. And this seems to really damage his reputation in America during this period, but also in Britain.
Yes, I mean, part of that was self-inflicted. Obviously not the cartoons and the caricatures. He was unfortunately, for him, that he grew up in the greatest age, really, of political satire in caricatures with Rowlandson and Gilray and Cruikshank and all these other sort of great and crushingly vicious cartoonists. But much more seriously was his one attempt, or at least his government's one attempt. He was a constitutional monarch. He didn't take these decisions himself. They were taken by politicians and the cabinet. But he did go along very much with the attempt to try to silence and imprison John Wilkes, the most notorious journalist of the era, who was spreading this rumor, of course, about his mother, about George's mother, Princess Augusta, sleeping with the Earl of Bute, and various other criticisms of the king, which were entirely untrue, and which the king, perfectly understandably, wanted to try to check. However, the heavy-handedness with which the government went about it, and the terrible backlash, basically, that came from the people who loved reading these scurrilous newspapers, made the whole thing much worse than it would have been had he just done nothing about it and taken no notice of it. And especially, as you point out, especially in America, where it fed into an already existing desire to be independent of Britain, and therefore the opportunity to make him look like a tyrant.
One of the things I didn't realize actually was that the Declaration of Independence essentially falls into two parts, and the second part is a critique of George, and a multi-pointed critique of George III. And it definitely seems like at that point they've gone so far down the road towards independence that the Americans really are just calling George Britain, really, or Parliament, and they don't really seem to have that kind of understanding that Parliament has pursued a lot of the lines rather than George personally.
That's right. And also, of course, all the previous monarchs, the 9 previous monarchs going back to Elizabeth I, had the same constitutional rights in America as George III had. And yet the Declaration of Independence attacks him for them. And the Declaration of Independence the first 2 paragraphs of it is a beautiful document. You know, it's uplifting. It says everything that needs to be said about equality and justice and liberty in so few words, Shakespearean language. I mean, it's a beautiful, sublime document. Then you get the second half, where there are 28 charges, personal ad hominem charges against George III, only 2 of which actually are true. But those 2, the fact that he had the right to, or at least Parliament had the right to tax the colonies, and also that they had the right to veto legislation in the colonies, those 2 were enough to justify the rebellion in and of itself. But that doesn't mean you have to go along now, 200 plus years later, with the absurd 26 charges, many of which just simply don't hold water at all. The whole of my chapter 13 is dedicated really to looking at all those charges and to see which ones are true and which aren't. And it's 2 that are and 26 that are complete rubbish, frankly.
Well, one of the things, though, I think you can probably, accuse him and the government of is a certain failure to face the reality of the situation in America during the course of the war. And they always think that they can either win or that they can sign a peace that will allow them to still have some kind of authority over America, or a relationship in terms of government. And like, the ship has sailed at that point, but they still think they might be able to claw something back.
That's right. Yes, it does seem extraordinary that even as late as 1782, after the surrender, you'd already got the surrender of General Burgoyne at Saratoga in October 1777, and then the surrender of General Cornwallis at Yorktown in October 1781, and yet still in 1772, the king and the cabinet believe that, and indeed Lord North's successor, believe that it's possible, Lord Shelburne, believe that it's possible to try to cobble together some kind of peace in which Britain was able to keep various nodal points along the eastern seaboard, including New York and Charleston, which, and I think Newport, Rhode Island was another one, which was completely absurd. There was simply no way that the Continental Army, that the American rebels, having got so far as to almost throw the British off the continent, would have agreed to a peace treaty that allowed them to have these extremely important ports in perpetuity.
George's reign is so long, and you can see the empire is expanding throughout the period. Now, obviously, they lose the 13 colonies, but it's expanding in India, in the West Indies, all over the world. There's more territory coming in under the British Empire. And yet, one of the kind of staggering things to look at is how different each one of them is governed. And I wondered, is that something that George ever reflects on, how each of the countries is treated in such a different way? So you've got Ireland with its Protestant parliament, and then you know, different kinds of relationships in lots of other countries, and of course slavery in some countries, and the East India Company in India.
Yes, no, there doesn't seem, it was very much a sort of haphazard way of going about it. Of course, famously, the historians Robinson and Gallagher in the 1960s talked about how the British Empire had been acquired in a fit of absence of mind. And there certainly doesn't seem to have been very much sort of thought put into the process of how this was going to be sort of melded together. There were no sort of Commonwealth concepts that it was going to be run in the same way in different places. You mentioned slavery, and I think it's a very important aspect. And I'd just like to say, almost as an aside, really, that in the course of, one of the reasons that I've been able to write this book in such a, shall we say, revisionist manner, is that the Queen has put over 100,000 pages of documents from George III's papers onto the Georgian Papers programme, this wonderful programme that King's College London has. And in those papers, there's a document from George III when, in the 1770s, he was Prince of Wales, in which he denounces slavery. He says that the arguments for them are ludicrous and the whole system needs to be held up to execration. And of course, he never owned a slave in his life, never bought or sold one, or had shares in the companies that did that. He signed the legislation to abolish the slave trade in 1807, but he never actually, again, this goes back a bit to his being a constitutional monarch, he never actually tried to abolish the slave trade. When there was a support of the majority for it in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, he didn't try to overturn that, which has to be, a blot on his historical escutcheon. But nonetheless, I think it does hark back to this idea of him being a constitutional monarch.
They are a phenomenal source to have, and it's something that you really exploit and go into throughout the book, and it's really amazing actually to see so much about his education and the education of a monarch. And before I go on to my next question, I know some people joined us late, so just to say you're welcome to add a question in the Q&A box, and we're going to get to those before we finish out. I can see there's a couple in there already, so we're going to come to those before the end. So before we come to maybe his period of unhealth, which of course is a huge I guess, thing that overshadows his whole reign, I do have to talk a little bit more about his relationship with his son, which is kind of extraordinary. And of course, I have to mention that, as you point out, George doesn't really travel very far. I mean, he's very much a British monarch. And one of the extraordinary things about him is he's the first British monarch is it since Queen Elizabeth, perhaps, to be born in England, and he speaks English, and so he's very British. He doesn't go very far, not to Ireland, but of course his son does come to Ireland and is popular for coming, the first king to come to Ireland without an invading army. But they do have this extraordinary relationship where they're really chalk and cheese.
That's right. And also George the Fourth went up to Scotland as well. I don't think he ever went to Hanover, but he was, yes, he was a much better travelled monarch than his father, but that wasn't, difficult. His father only ever met one other European monarch in the whole of his 60-year reign, and that was Christian VII of Denmark, who was his son-in-law. So, he really didn't have that personal interaction with monarchs. And this might have been a very bad thing, in fact, because at the time of the American War of Independence, Britain had no allies. We had France declare war on us in 1778, Spain in 1779, and Holland in 1780. And the allies that we could have looked to, Russia, Austria, and so on, Prussia, we had managed to irritate or frustrate in the previous years. So there was a dearth of British diplomacy. Again, not necessarily his personal faults. There were foreign secretaries to do that kind of thing, but it was a problem. And with regard to the relationship with his son, as you say, it was sort of nigh on disastrous. But his son behaved so abominably. He at one point published private letters that the king had written to him, published them in the newspapers. He was constantly having endless mistresses who the king had to pay for their blackmail letters before they were published. He took no notice at all about the spiraling debt that he got into, knowing that one day he would be king and therefore Parliament would have to pay them off. But I'm afraid George IV does come out as a rather despicable figure, frankly, from my book.
He definitely lacks, I guess, the intellect of George III, and he seems to rack up so many debts that anything he does comes across as very self-serving, and because of that, he's used as a political pawn, particularly, when difficulties arise for George III.
That's right. The radical Whigs, especially Charles James Fox, who befriend George, Prince of Wales, and are hoping the whole way through that George III is going to die soon, and that And when, of course, he does go mad and the regency crisis takes place, they all assume that George the Fourth is going to make them, to bring them into government. And then he doesn't. He betrays his oldest and closest friends the minute he becomes Prince Regent. So, this really is a man with very few redeeming qualities, except for his beautiful taste in art. He has a wonderful aesthetic temperament, and you can tell that from his houses and his art collection and so on, the Brighton Pavilion and so on. But these are things, of course, that ultimately are paid for by the taxpayer.
I find that staggering as well, that you mentioned that he never asked the cost of anything, and he's really, in that sense, not George III's son. George III is so frugal, and there are points that he's donating money to the national debt, and when food is scarce, George and Charlotte are eating very sparse, and she talks about that, but none of that is happening with George IV. And of course, the big crunch point comes when he published his personal correspondence between his father and himself. And even then, one of the things that I was astonished by is George III says he can't trust his son again, but he does, I guess, keep things open.
For a year, yes, they don't talk for a year. But then after that, there's yet another reconciliation, because George IV knows how to get round the king, which is by appealing to his mother, Queen Charlotte, and to their endless numbers of siblings, and they are the ones who prevail on George III to sort of let him back in. And the minute he is let back in, then the purse strings are opened again, and he winds up getting into enormous debts almost immediately. As I say, I do find it difficult. I have tried with this book, I promise, but I have found it difficult to find any redeeming features beyond this wonderful taste in art that he can't afford.
Well, you've definitely mentioned something positive there. Yeah, even his relationship with his wife, it is unbelievable. But again, it's that kind of delving into their personal relationships is so interesting, and it makes it such a great part of the biography.
There's a wonderful gag. Sorry, can I just pass in with a wonderful gag where, of course, he himself has the most terrible, this is George IV again, most terrible relationship with his wife, Caroline, and he bans her from the coronation, and he tries to take their child away, and he behaves disgracefully with any number of mistresses who he tries to get into her ladies in waiting positions and so on, and they wind up absolutely loathing one another. And then in 1821, when Napoleon Bonaparte has died, a courtier comes in and says to the Prince Regent, the king by then, your greatest enemy is dead, Your Majesty. Is she, by God? Then replies George IV.
Oh, you couldn't make it up. That's no problem. I have to touch as well on the Catholic question, particularly because that overshadows so much politics in Dublin and in Ireland. And of course, I think I was really struck by the fact that George III, so he has this great relationship with Pitt, who he trusts. Pitt is fixing a lot of the problems in the national debt. He's a fantastic manager. And Pitt wants to support Catholic emancipation. I know around this time, George is taking delegations from prominent Catholic merchants from Dublin who go to see him. I actually studied one of them for my PhD, and Pitt is pushing him in this direction, and George will not budge, and this destroys their relationship.
Yes, and Pitt's premiership as well, of course. I think in part, the first thing to remember is that unlike earlier Hanoverians, and unlike a large number of people at that time, when only has to look at the Gordon riots of the 1780s, George was not a bigot. He was not an anti-Catholic bigot. He made positive references to the Jesuits at the time of the French Revolution. He stayed with Catholics. He was the first king since the Glorious Revolution to actually stay with Catholics in their houses. He visited the chapel of Thomas Weld and other prominent Catholics and so on. So this is not a person who was some foaming low church Protestant bigot. What he was, though, unfortunately, really for Catholic emancipation, was a true believer in the actual wording of the coronation oath that he took at his coronation in 1761, which committed him to protecting the Protestant religion as by law established, which he took to mean not giving the vote to the Catholics. You have to remember, of course, at that time that only about 1 in 12 Britons had the vote. It wasn't considered a sort of human right to have the franchise in the same way that we assume it today. It was a very much a stratified society between those who did and those who didn't. And unfortunately, the king also, of course, recognized, as I mentioned again and again, he was a constitutional monarch, and there was no majority, even in the cabinet. Pitt the Younger didn't have a majority in his own cabinet for Catholic emancipation. There certainly wasn't one in the wider government, and there certainly wasn't one in the House of Lords or the House of Commons. And there wasn't to be until 9 years after the king's death. So understandably, some historians have wondered why Pitt suddenly sprung emancipation on the king without having buttered him up beforehand, without having mentioned it beforehand. It was suddenly brought up as government policy by Pitt and by a very small number of people around him, including Lord Castlereagh. And some people think that actually after 17 plus years of being in government, Pitt was exhausted. He no longer wanted to carry the burden, but he didn't want to resign on something less liberal, less enlightened, less forward-thinking, less progressive than the cause of Catholic emancipation. And I slightly go along with that, I think.
Looking at the Q&A box filling up, so I'm going to ask about one final thing. It seems like the two big issues that overshadow his reign are obviously the loss of the American colonies and his periods of mental unhealth. And you discussed a little bit about how that's been misdiagnosed in the past. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, one of the things that everyone knows about George III is that he had porphyria, this physiological illness. But it's become completely clear to medical experts in the last 10 years or so that that's not true. Back in the 1960s, a mother and son team, medical team, put forward this concept of porphyria. But now that people, half a century, have looked into their methods and their rather, frankly, intellectually dishonest methodology, it's no longer possible to continue with that. The experts on porphyria and also on manic depression and particularly on the bipolar disorder side of manic depression pretty much all agree now that it wasn't porphyria at all, it was that. And so I go into this in the appendix in some detail. I don't want to put off any of our viewers, but quite a lot of it is to do with the colour of urine and feces that the king produced, and the ways in which it could be the colour, bluish purple colour that comes from porphyria, and the other ways that that might have happened, including the medicines that he was taking, eating beetroot, for example, is one of them, and other things. So the one of the two things that people know about George III is completely wrong. And also, the idea that it was his obstinacy that lost us the colonies and that he was a tyrant, I think is also completely wrong.
Thank you so much for talking a little bit more about that. So I'm having a look at the Q&A box, which is filled up. And one of the questions down here is, could you talk a little bit about George III's relationship with his daughters?
Yes, he loved his daughters, but the drawback was, for political and strategic reasons, they could only marry Protestant princes, and the only ones around really were in Germany and some in Scandinavia. And so you have a terrible situation that basically only one of them gets married to someone like that, and the rest stay in what they call the nunnery, which was a house near Windsor, which was not a nunnery at all. It was just them trying to sort of satirize the fact that they weren't allowed to have relationships, but they did. Indeed, one of them had an illegitimate child, and both of them with courtiers, soldiers, effectively. One of these was essentially, to all intents and purposes, a marriage, although not obviously legally one. It was kept from the king. George III never discovered this, even though she was, as I say, sort of almost living as husband and wife with this colonel. So it's not a happy story, but again, it's a systemic thing that comes from the politics of the era and the strategy of the era. You couldn't just marry off the child of a monarch to a international enemy, a rival. That just made no sense whatsoever, which cuts out an awful lot of the families of Europe at the time, sadly.
One of our other questions here is, did you regret having to leave anything out of the book, or have you covered everything?
You always regret. In fact, I cut I think 20,000 words when the publishers pointed out that it was getting a little bit hefty, because there are 100 pages of notes, bibliography, and index at the back, which I never really have been able to understand now in the era of the internet, where you can't just put all of that paraphernalia on the website, except the index, which of course you do need for a serious and substantial work. But yes, no, I cut out lots of things, but I never cut out a theme. I made the themes all shorter. So there isn't a subject that I've just completely missed. I don't believe. I hope not, anyhow. But what I have had to do is to truncate various things that I'd have loved to have gone into in more detail.
Okay. So somebody else here is making an Irish connection. Before his marriage, George III fell in love with Lady Sarah Lennox, whose sister was Emily, Duchess of Leinster, and had she married George, he would have become uncle of Lord Edward Fitzgerald, the son of Sarah's sister Emily, Duchess of Leinster, who was one of the leaders of the 1798 rebellion.
Yes, I know that. No, that's a very good what if of history. I mean, two things could have happened. Either he wouldn't have become one of the leaders of the 1798 rebellion, or George might have been able to have been brought closer to the whole idea of a further relief of the Catholics. I mean, there was the Catholic Relief Act of 1793, of course, but it didn't go terribly far. And then you have the huge imbroglio after the uprising of the Act of Union, which was pushed through in a frankly as corrupt a way as the 18th century could allow, which was pretty corrupt. So it is a what if of history. If he'd had some people who maybe understood and appreciated Ireland a bit closer to him, then things might have gone differently. But you have to remember, of course, that like most of the rest of the Hanoverians, and like all of them, they entirely depended on their Protestantism for where they were. Had it not been for William of Orange and the Protestant succession, they would have been electors of Hanover and not kings of Britain. So, they, in a sense, were the prisoners of their own religious destiny.
Somebody else here is asking, how had British society changed over the 60 years of his reign?
Hugely, yes. It started off under George II being pretty loose, and then when he became king, he put out a proclamation against vice and tried to crack down pornography and various other things like that, it didn't really work. The 18th century, as we discussed earlier, what people did write pretty much what they wanted. They did have the laws of libel, of course, but it got more and more loose, especially the further up you got in the social scale, the aristocracy. I use the Brooks's Club betting book quite a lot, and basically the drinking and whoring and gambling and behaviour at Brooks's Club, the heart of the radical Whig establishment, was entirely dissolute, and George III hated that, and they despised him as a prig for hating that. And then during the French Revolution, things do tend to calm down a bit, not least, I suppose, because the aristocracy looked across the channel and saw what was happening to their French equivalents. And then you get the Regency, where George IV takes over as Prince Regent during the King's periods of manic depression, and which get longer and longer. And in the end, actually, are 10 years, of the last 10 years of his life, he's mad as well as senile and blind and deaf. And so the Prince Regent, who's himself immensely dissolute, and I go into some of the parties where, you have the Prince of Wales throwing up in the corner, whilst the dinner's still going on. And so you have at the end of his life also a huge return to dissolution, but by that stage he's cooped up in Windsor Castle.
It does seem like a very sad ending for George III, particularly because he is separated from his wife at that point. It's very kind of poignant end. And I guess for her, her and George had been critics of their son, and she has to go back to her son for protection at that point.
Yes, and they never visit him either. That's the other sad thing, I mean, he is, as I say, senile at that stage, but he's at Windsor. It's not far. They were living in a different part of the town at the time, and yet they only seem to visit him once every sort of 5 years or so. So it's a truly horrible and sad ending. He didn't even know that the Battle of Waterloo had been won, and the Napoleonic Wars that he'd been so keen on ensuring a British victory in had finally ended in that victory.
It is very staggering to visit him every 5 years, like very, very sad, is particularly, as you say, when that proximity is so close to each other. It's rather shocking. I'm just having a look through our questions. So somebody has asked, have you decided on another biographical subject, or are you taking a break from biographies after all your hard work over the past decade and more?
I wish. No, I'm afraid I've got a mortgage. I can't take time off work. I'd love to, but impossible. No, I'm going to be actually, funny enough, my next biographical subject is of someone who was born in Dublin at Chapel Lizard on the outskirts of Dublin at that time, anyhow. And that's Lord Northcliffe, Alfred Harmsworth, Lord Northcliffe, who later was the owner of the Daily Mail and the Times, and who at the outbreak of the First World War was the owner of 40% of British newspapers, so by circulation. So, of course, an immensely powerful figure. Somebody else who actually also went mad at the end of his life. I don't know what it is that's drawn me towards that, but nonetheless, in his by the time he died, he was also absolutely terribly afflicted by mental illness. And I think actually talking about mental illness is one of the good things, I think, about being able to bring out a book now on George III, is that we don't have the same stigma attached to mental illness that lots of historians did have in the earlier part of, well, certainly through the 20th century and earlier. And so it's not considered a sort of moral failing in the way that the Whig historians attach to George III. There was one one 1950s historian who said that he thought that George III had gone mad because he was forced to make love so often to his hideous wife. I mean, that is something you would never, ever in a million years consider today, let alone write in a history book, and rightly so. And so I think it's a very good thing that I've been able to write in a much more enlightened and liberal-minded era.
Absolutely. We are coming towards the end of our time, so I have one last question, which was, what was the reaction of the royal family in Britain to the execution of the royal family in France during the French Revolution?
That's a very good question. There was a period of mourning. The whole court went into mourning. The king and queen cancelled their social engagements, didn't go to the theatre, cancelled the concerts that they had arranged, and so on. Even though, of course, it had been Louis XVI whose declaration of war against Britain in 1778 had turned the American Revolution into a global war and ensured, essentially, that we lost it because it was a French fleet off Yorktown that meant that the British could not reinforce Lord Cornwallis. So, he had been instrumental in our defeat in the American War of Independence, along with the American Patriots and the Continental Army and great generals like Washington. So you have this situation where his rival and greatest rival in Europe and enemy, essentially, had died. But the way he died, being guillotined by revolutionaries, was obviously something that was absolute anathema to George, and he very much supported the anti-peace party. He didn't want to make peace with a regicide country like France. And this is a very important aspect in terms of how Napoleon ultimately was defeated, because when Prussia was at war with France for 53 months from 1792 to 1815, and the Russians for 55 months, and the Austrians for 108 months, Britain was at war with France in that period for 242 months, so more than all of the rest of them put together. And that was absolutely instrumental in bearing down on French trade and exports and so on. And of course, the various military defeats that it suffered in the peninsula and at Waterloo.
Okay, I'm looking at the clock. Before I hand back to Brendan, I just want to say Dublin expands so much during George III's reign. And one of the things that is really striking about this book is so many of the historic figures who make up the statues on our streets and the names of our streets are in this book. So you will learn so much about Dublin during this period by reading this book. Andrew, this is such a fantastic book. Thank you so much. It's been really great to chat, and thank you. I hope I haven't monopolized you too much.
No, all I was going to say, you had not in the slightest degree, thank you very much indeed. All I was going to say was, I hope that when my next book comes out, as I say, who's essentially somebody who was born in Dublin, you'll invite me back and I can actually come in person, which has proved to be impossible this time, sadly.
Chapel is beautiful. You'll have to go out there.
Of course, delighted. Want to.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa Marie. Thank you so much, Andrew. I thought it was fascinating. And